infrastructure spending. Which kind of infrastructure spending is best? This was the Patreon topic. Patreon.com/the3wonks. If you want to become a fellow 3Wonk Patreon member and have a say in what we talk to on a week-to-week basis, some weeks like this week, the Patreons actually picked entirely what we talked about. Intellectual property was what we talked about right before this. Now we're talking about what kind of infrastructure spending is best. An overview. Why do we even care about infrastructure spending, and why does big government need to be involved in infrastructure spending? I'll go first on this one. So why do we care about infrastructure investment? Infrastructure investment fundamentally enables economic activity, right? So that's one of the reasons why we like infrastructure investment. We like enabling economic activity. Why do we like enabling economic activity? Because economic activity is what allows us to live the sort of cushy or not very cushy lives that we lead. It kind of comes down to economic activity, whether it be, socialized, privatized, market-oriented, non-market-oriented, whatever it might be. It's all the economy, right? And so infrastructure investment that enables that economic activity is important. And there's also a lot of sort of non-tangible benefits to various infrastructure. Some of the examples of, things that might develop human capital in some ways, but don't necessarily directly involve economic activity. They might just sort of improve your general quality of life. Things like community centers, parks, public beaches and public pools and things like that, right? These are things that maybe it's not as clean that they're improving your economic circumstance, but they're definitely things that it seems like intuitively most people value. It's a part of infrastructure as well. And my answer as to why big government needs to be involved in infrastructure is kind of what SDL said in our previous segment, I should say, about intellectual property. There are just certain kinds of investments that private actors have a very difficult time doing. Infrastructure is one of those things. It's just a really expensive thing to do, right? A lot of infrastructure projects are very expensive. It's also not necessarily clear the payoff for a lot of infrastructure investment. And it's also not necessarily clear that a lot of infrastructure that we want to be invested in should be behind a paywall rather than just sort of an openly available piece of infrastructure. Like a lot of people, a lot of wonky people like the idea of making every highway a toll road because, surge pricing and demand pricing is based, and oh my goodness, how awesome is that? But you go to an average fucking person on the street and tell them every highway is going to be a toll road, and they're going to call you a dumbass, right? Because no, we hate toll roads. Most average people think that a lot of infrastructure should be a public good of sort, or, at the very least free at the point of service, right? And so that's why big government probably inherently needs to be involved. Thoughts, guys, on the overview? Why is infrastructure spending something worth caring about? And why does big government need to be involved?
I mean, one of the other answers is just that there's a multiplier, that infrastructure spending generally enables economic activity, but the person charging the rents on the road can't encompass all of the benefits of that economic activity because it's not private. So it's positive externalities. Yeah.
I think there is a fundamental problem of certain forms of infrastructure in the sense that you can't charge for it. You can't charge people to enter the sidewalk in front of their house. Or to walk places. That would just be like just tolls on the sidewalk. That would be.
Why not, Micah? Think bigger.
We've got all these drones, right? That they can capture your faces. Just saying, there's real innovation to be had here in walking charging technology.
Right. Like just imagine cameras just charging people for every step they take on the sidewalk, and every bit of driving they do on the roads. Also, it's a monopoly, right? Like if you live on a piece of property, there's only one sidewalk that's going to be in front of you. There's not going to be multiple sidewalks, right? So there's really basic forms of infrastructure which need some sort of collective ownership model. Now, you could have like ownership by your neighborhood association. Like they have that in Sweden, actually. They have like a lot of ownership by like the cooperative ownership of like roads. It's like private. I know some libertarians talk about this, but it's still not like for-profit business owned. But I think people do overrate how much infrastructure needs. For instance, if you look at the history of this country, we used to have a really elaborate private rail network, and all of it was private. New York's metro, it's private. Japan has the best rail system in the world, it's private. Its metro systems are also private. And Mexico, they have bus rapid transit, which is a huge form of transportation. And in many cities around the world, those bus rapid transportation systems use private buses. So not everything has to be private. There's a lot of arguments that certain forms of infrastructure are actually better private. Let me give you one example. Brightline in Florida is the most successful recent rail project we've seen in this country, and it was done for the cost of under, I believe, $50 billion. Please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it was like 20 or something like that. Meanwhile, California's high-speed rail project is north of $100 billion in cost, and it's been going on for way longer, and it's not even close to being complete. Right. And so you could say private companies maybe have more of an incentive to minimize cost, to not engage in the kind of like stupid contracting, which is like super, needs to make everything green and needs to make everything go to the right form of small businesses and whatever, and so on and so forth. So infrastructure is very important. Some of it needs to be public. All of it needs to be well funded, because even private mass transit needs public support because it's really expensive. And as STL says, there's positive externalities. And if there's positive externalities, you need subsidies. And if it's extremely, extremely capital intensive, you probably need public capital to be made available for it. Let me give you one more example. The Texas Central High-Speed Rail Project, which is supposed to connect Houston and Dallas, has received all of the approvals from the government. There's eminent domain, it's received its permits, everything, right? But it has not happened. Why? Because billions and billions, probably north of $10 billion of cost, is hard to raise from shareholders, especially for a very long-term project, because most people don't want to send billions of dollars to a company with the idea that they might get paid in 12 years, most of that money back, right? They don't want to do that. And so that's why the government needs to be there to help fix that issue.
Yep, government needs to be involved. That's kind of inherently part of our positions. Again, whether the ownership model and things like that, of course, we can quibble on. Our public transit episode, we talked about that as well. The type of ownership model for public transit, and you could probably hear us talk about that to a bit of a more in-depth degree. But guys, that's not exactly the topic. Let's start with Micah. What kind of infrastructure spending is the best kind, and why do you say it's the best?
Say mass transit is really, really important. I think, of course, there's plenty of metros around this country which have like no riders and receive tons of public money. So clearly, it's not all public spending on mass transit is good. I think for the potential highest ROI spending is on mass transit, because it's a much more efficient way of us moving around. I'd say like developing metros.
I mean, I totally agree with the mass transit point. One of the benefits is that they are often fairly capital intensive. There's also just network effects, right? Like the larger the network is, the more those positive externalities will be. The more places you can go on one network, the easier. So all that amounts to that you probably need more public financing for stuff like mass transit than individual transit, right?
Yeah, roads are bad. We don't like
right.
roads so much. Eisenhower destroyed this country with freeways. And here's something that we should say. Unlike some communists around here, I believe that people should have to pay for what they use. That includes roads, except for the roads, like side roads, like freeways. Definitely you should have to pay for that. Look at Singapore. Singapore uses ERP congestion pricing and for heavily used roads, and it is fantastic. It raises revenue, it reduces traffic. It's phenomenal. And the biggest problem that we've had in this country is that we don't charge people to use the road. It's fully subsidized, while mass transit or old mass transit systems you had to pay for. And what did that do? People respond to price incentives. They would use the freeway over the paid private rail, and that's why they all got absolutely decimated.
No, I mean there's a really big incentive difference here. Well, so the I think that differential is something. It's one of the undertold stories of U.S. infrastructure is that we enormously financed federal highways. In fact, the government doesn't even take enough taxes to pay for the cost of maintaining those highways. The gas tax pays for, I think it's now about a third, but I could be wrong. I think that's out of date. Like a third of the cost we spend for highways. We don't raise nearly enough taxes from drivers to account for the subsidy we provide to it. So of course people shift towards highways. You've made it cheap. There's a lot of reasons to do so, right? Like if cars are cheap and they're easy, and we have subsidized roads in every street, we literally subsidize suburbs through mortgage deductions and stuff, right? There's all these collective reasons we built up that, of course, you're not going to use a mass transit because you live in the suburbs, you drive on subsidized roads, you use subsidized fuel effectively. Like, of course you'll shift to that. So I don't know. As a radical, I agree with the neoliberal. It would actually be funny to see. I would like to see public-owned transits, not private transits, but same difference. I'm sorry, public-owned tolls, not private tolls on highways. Yeah, make people
But
pay
the
for what
problem
they're
is
using.
the government's just really bad at doing stuff. And I saw that Najawan or whatever this guy is, my number one hater in the replies is saying the only reason why California's high-speed rail project is so expensive is because of CEQA. Now CEQA sucks. It should be absolutely destroyed. So should so many elements of our national permitting process be destroyed. For those who don't know, CEQA is something that makes environmental review for California projects even more strenuous than it is nationally under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So it's bad. But the reality is there's so many examples of the government spending money very inefficiently and administering things very inefficiently. And that's because, well, the government actors don't necessarily always have the best incentives. We have tons of examples of public sector contracts where the government gives public employees tons of job protections, gives them non-competitive salaries, unsustainable retirement benefits, because those public sector unions are constituents. They support, they donate to the campaign, they vote, they knock on doors. We've seen this a lot, and sometimes it looks a bit like a quid pro quo. We've also seen contracting, including with the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill, be really ridiculous because we have all these standards that preference certain types of really small businesses, Buy America requirements, like renewable energy requirements have to be renewably provided, right? All these super high labor standards. And what does it do? It just raises the cost a lot. And sometimes it produces absurdities where, for instance, we were supposed to fund all of these these
big.
None of them have been built.
You cut out. Repeat. You were talking about chargers, I think.
Right. We were supposed to build all these new, super high standard, amazing, incredible quality EV chargers around the country, and none of them have been built. Why? Because the standards were not reasonable.
Well,
right?
But I don't know. I think that I will say though that I think that we can cleanly kind of talk about this because obviously national regulations are national, right? You know, every state in theory has to deal with a lot of these regulations. And I think that you can compare like renewable energy development in a place like Texas to a place like maybe California, or, maybe, slightly less regulatory burdensome blue states like Illinois, where they don't have this CEQA thing, but, they still have to deal with the same national regulations. The difference in those two states, and you see a huge difference in renewables deployment, is that it's just generally easier to build. Now, you still have the same sort of boosted subsidies for, union wages and things like this that you're talking about, Micah, but way more renewables being built at cheaper costs in Texas than in a state like Illinois or Washington, places like this.
Blanket illegal. A lot of times the government just makes things completely and totally illegal to do. Right.
Well, also much more expensive, right? And so that's what I'm saying is that I think that I was going to say, SDL, real quick. I think that the big problem here is not necessarily things like small business contracting standards or boosted subsidies for. No, it's not. Like in terms of degrees, the big problem is NIMBY regulations preventing land use for productive activities and stuff like that. There's a lot of public infrastructure development in other countries that goes substantially under or on budget, and the big difference is that it's just easier to build things in a lot of those places.
You have to keep in mind.
All I want to say, just for the sake of time, because I know we have about 20 minutes left, we did a whole discussion, maybe not as in depth as it should have been, on SOEs versus private enterprises. I think one of our takeaways was that often they're fairly comparable, but one of Econoboy's insights, I argue, was that often where there's a social benefit the government is trying to pursue, they are less efficient. Where they're run like a business, they seem to be about on par. All I want is Joe Manchin put in charge of the national toll road system, okay? Is that too much to punish him for all the fossil fuel he emitted into the world, that he must run the toll road system on
that
highways,
is his purgatory.
like a business?
That's true.
I just think they are very rarely ever run like a business, especially in the United States, because of a ton of political incentives, which are deleterious.
Well, put Joe Manchin up there. He's unflappable. Clearly, nothing can persuade that man. Not even
I know.
West Virginia into a utopia.
I know, but I think that, maybe again, we can have another one of these videos. I think I've come up with like, an endless number of examples of the kind of rent seeking that we see with kind of politicians trying to give up all these giveaways to certain constituencies and make things sound better than they are. And doing it basically sabotaging their own spending, being extraordinarily wasteful of what they do. We see this all the time with even demand side subsidies, right? Oh, we're going to do this demand side subsidy here, this demand side subsidy here. Why? It sounds really good. It makes the constituency happy. The realtors like the housing subsidies. Is it good policy? No, it's not. Because, ultimately the government doesn't work in our best interest. It works in the interest of those political actors which make the decisions, which are often very different than what's good for us all.
Uh-oh. Cut out, repeat.
My God, the IT issues.
But we should be funding public infrastructure. It should just, some of it should be private.
Well, so what we were talking about before you came back, Econoboy, was just toll roads and highways. I don't know. I'm not actually that opposed to it. I think you'd probably need a gradated roll out of it. But like, especially in a world where like we're not taxing gas, and as we're moving towards electric vehicles, you need some way to tax vehicles. In fact, we're currently subsidizing EVs, right? So, which, in my opinion, is ridiculous. We give in this country $125 billion a year to highways, is my understanding, and about like $1.2 billion to rails and other mass transit. The spending in this country is in fact ridiculous relative to where we'd expect the most social benefit to occur. I want to see mega cities. I want to see mass transit projects. I want to see both ecologically and budget efficient. One of the things that's under discussed as well, spreading people out makes the economy less efficient and makes city budgets less efficient. It's incredible. People who live in density on the order of New York City, they cost about 1/5 as much per person to get public services like schools, pipes, all the other crap to their house than people out in the sticks. Even relative to suburbs, it's about a 2 to 3 times difference. So yes, I want to cram everyone to the cities. That I think should be an explicit policy goal.
SDL believes in the big cube.
That's right.
That is his policy.
Both because it is more efficient for city budgets, but two, it's economically efficient. There is a ton of evidence that simply being able to talk to other people, walk to other people, living in dense spaces is economically beneficial because it has scale effects. So yeah, let's maximize scale effects, bomb the suburbs back into the cities.
Big cube. Yeah, I think overall,
Prophecy does not endorse this.
I mean, I am an urbanist myself. I really think what you need to do is just restore choice. I think that people reflect their preferences whenever they're given a real marketplace to do so. And I think the government, this is an example of the government thinking it knows what's best for everybody and it going really awry. Back in right after the World War II period, we decided that it was the age of the car. The government took deliberate action to orient our entire society around automobiles. They dug up trains and trolley cars because they said this is our time. They put in place regulations to make everything car-centric, like parking requirements, density limits, and the like. They said they knew what's best for us, and they were wrong. And if they would have just let us reveal our own preferences with choices and market-based mechanisms, well, then we would have a much better orientation of our urban spaces today. I don't think that the solution to that is the government to go balls to the wall, like let's go to war against cars. I think it's just restore choice, and eventually I think we're going to lead to where I want us to go. But I think there is a certain epistemic humbleness that I like to have, which I think people that are more in favor of using state power don't have, which is that I have policy views, but ultimately I think that we need to have a very high degree of confidence before the government backs something. Because ultimately the government is an entity of force. Everything it does is coercive. It takes people's stuff, it gives it to other people. It makes laws. It says you can't do this thing you wanted to do, you can't do this, or you have to do this thing which you didn't want to do, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we're like anarchists and we're going to say the government shouldn't do anything. It just means that before we use force against each other, we should be really sure that we have a good reason to do so. And we should also be really sure that this policy is actually going to achieve what we want it to achieve.
I will just say, on the war on cars, I will hold my peace. I will not say anything. But if I speak, but more broadly, I do broadly agree. I do just think, again, one of the understated positive externalities I think of, like you've mentioned, that yes, there's many private systems which have fairly efficient mass transit systems. But if we think that there's positive externalities to this, we want even more than the private market would occur. Like, in other words, if we think there are super normal, like positive returns to scale from people living in cities, which I do, I think there's pretty strong reason to believe it. then I think that you really do want to densify people, like like even more than their preferences might indicate, by subsidizing those decisions. That's all.
I'm not sure you'd have to talk about what it would look like if we actually had um, no distortionary backing of automobiles,
Sure.
and like people were really given choice, and whether the output of urbanism, like the urban environment it would give us, would be really substantially different from like what we'd say the optimal one is, and whether we could actually appraise positive externalities. Because it looks like right now
It's
the government is basically like doubling down on something with negative externalities.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's like once you remove the doubling down on negative externalities, there's like some extra positive externality which is left over.
Yeah, SCL, it seemed like you wanted to say something. I guess I can jump in. Yeah, I think that overall, I would say that my answer to the fundamental question of the audience, what is the best type of infrastructure spending? The way that I like to think about it is like, what's the kind of infrastructure spending that you could spend too much on in general, right? And there's certain kinds of infrastructure where it's like, man, it just seems like if the government quintupled down on the amount of spending they did, it just seems like we'd get better results, right? So, and it does depend on the country. Like, some of the things that Micah mentioned, I see maps like this all the time where it's like amount of investment in public high-speed rail, and it's like by country, and you see this crazy rail infrastructure that China has versus America. Now in China, they've arguably overinvested, right? Because you see news stories where it's like China spends 10 billion equivalent USD on this new rail line, and literally nobody uses it, right? Even though it's really nice and fancy or whatever, right? So they've probably gone a little bit overboard. But in the US, as an example, we could probably stand to spend significantly more on our rail infrastructure than we
if we
do
spent
now.
10 times, it wouldn't be an issue.
I mean, actually true, unironically. Now, I think that this is all in the context, ideally in hopefully a more YIMBYist type regulatory environment where public dollars can actually be executed efficiently. That's something that's worth talking about as well. Like if I was in California, I don't know if I'd support a lot of public spending on infrastructure. We talked about this very early on in our housing episode with just Micah and I, where like if I lived in San Francisco, I literally don't think I would support putting money into public housing because it's so ridiculously hard to build anything in San Francisco. It's like, what are we even paying for? We're spending $1 million to build one public toilet. That's a real thing that happened in San Francisco. It's literally unbelievable how expensive it is to build anything in San Francisco because of all the regulatory burden. The absolute primary thing is regulatory burden when it comes to building things, especially things like cross-state line infrastructure projects that can get just ridiculously complicated on the infrastructure. One of the reasons why, in Texas, there's been talk for decades about a high-speed rail line between Houston and Dallas. It's very complicated, even intrastate, to go across county lines and across multiple cities to connect two cities by way of a high-speed rail line, even though in theory it's something that a lot of people would really love and really take advantage of. I mean, I don't know who would want to actually go to Dallas personally, but presumably there are some people that would want to go to Dallas. But people have been talking about it for a long time. And so, that's something worth really thinking about as well. But I think
I agree.
We want to build it so they can escape over here and then go back whenever they're eventually.
That's true. A one-way rail line, one-way tickets only, just, for functional purposes.
I agree. The most efficient way to spend the $100 billion federal infrastructure budget would be lobbying every state to adopt a uniform zoning code with no community input.
I think it's important to recognize something else that I did not mention previously, which plays into what I've been saying on this podcast for a long time, and I'm going to say with increasing sophistication. Okay, as I repeat, I'll get better at saying it, which is that politicians respond to political incentives, and politicians make up the government, and those political incentives often include lobbyists. Which leads politicians, and changing political coalitions to abandon projects prematurely. We've seen this all over the place. Look at the UK, HS2. What happened to that? What happened to HS2? That's Texas Central project you just mentioned. Republicans are against it now. Why? The political coalitions have shifted, and so the long term, there is not. Public projects have this issue with long term political resolve that private projects may not have issue with, and if you can give public capital to reliable public capital to those projects, long-term credit, you can maybe get the best of both worlds. And there's also community review. Okay, we hate it. It's disgusting. It's terrible. It's all over the place. Everything the government does, people are able to go to community meetings about it. And I think it's the product of a political incentive in that politicians want to get credit for the stuff they do, and they want to make sure that the constituents that actually are paying attention are happy with it. And so they want to include them as much as possible. And it just so happens to be the case that those constituents have stupid ideas. And this process makes it take way longer than it should. It's bad, but it might be politically beneficial.
It would be extremely funny. Okay, I just want to pose a hypothetical. So we're 5 years down the line. Yimbism, the woke mind virus, has taken over the American people, right? So now at your community review meetings, nobody shows up to oppose the project. It's just a cheerleading session, right? You're like, I want to build a high-speed rail line. This is where I'm building it. And 10 girls just come out right there. They got their pom-poms out. They're like, yes, please, sir. The Boy Scouts come out. They're saluting you.
I'd love it. I would love it personally. I want those community input meetings to be like when Kim Jong-un goes to a campaign rally in North Korea. Okay, how many
on the gates, please give us.
How many of you approve of this project? It's 99.99%. One undecided. Okay, that's the kind of vote that I want on our public infrastructure projects. But anyway, but that's kind of my thought. I think that in terms of what infrastructure spending is best, it's pretty easy to identify in most countries what type of infrastructure is really underinvested in. In America, for instance, rail infrastructure, like I mentioned, is probably one of those things. You could argue that like highway infrastructure might be underinvested in from a maintenance perspective. You might say like our ports and bridges need more investment to be, to be expanded and maintained. Things like this. In terms of what infrastructure America overinvests in, it's hard to say because I think our infrastructure is typically graded pretty poorly. So I'm not sure what we might claw back money from.
Well, I think in states like Texas, we definitely overinvest in freeways because we're always freaking expanding them. We keep elevating them, making them wider. I mean, it's absolutely
when I say underinvest in highways, I mean like insofar as we have highways that people are driving on, they shouldn't be falling apart. Right, like they should be well paved and maintained. And if they're not going to be well paved and maintained, might as well just knock them down and say we're not driving here anymore. Versus having the shitty fucking carpet bombed looking highways that we have in some areas of this country.
I do want to offer the urbanist perspective for like the privatized toll roads. If you do ever want to end the highways, it will actually, you're right, Micah, be a big political problem if the politicians have to kill it. But if you privatize it, and then eventually cars become so rare and expensive, well, then you don't have to kill the highway. They'll just shut it down.
Well, it's because whenever people have to pay the cost of driving a car, and that includes the external cost of like carbon taxation for the emissions they cause, maybe some other tax because of the particulate matter effects, it's really expensive. It's really expensive. People like a lot of the inefficient decisions that people make in this country are not because of like they're consumers are not rational enough. Like they're just really stupid, right? No, it's because we have all these things largely distorted by government intervention, all these crazy subsidies, in large part that are in place because of special interest group capture and really bad decisions by bureaucrats.
I admire your support for historical materialism and the importance of materialism for people's politics. I do unfortunately think there is a sort of cultural hysteresis, cultural lock-in, where like cars are part of people's lifestyles, living in suburbans, like it's part of like being a masculine man that you have like a picket fence. Like I am worried about sort of cultural lock-in. That's part of the reason I'm willing to say like there is in fact a necessity of public funding of sort of urbanization. Like you actually want to counteract those cultural effects as much as you can.
I think that I don't know how locked in they are because like when people move to a place like DC where like it's really inconvenient to use a car, it's pretty inconvenient. You don't have to pay that much for it, but it's really inconvenient. And the mass transit's there. Now they want to use it. Right?
People definitely do switch, and there's been some really interesting studies even on the rollout of Uber on reducing car ownership. So like when you provide alternatives to car ownership, people do reduce it, but it's in particular, it's only say like a 50% reduction. It's not like a complete replacement. That's what you'd expect if cars still have some utility, sure. But it's also just that I think the people who are willing to move to a city may be different than those who are stuck out in the suburbs, right? Like there's actually a literal political difference there that overwhelmingly people in the cities will be voting Dem and probably do not have the same machismo idea of like car, suburb, picket fence, strong guy, strong car.
The last thing I'll say on this, and then Cameron, you can say whatever you want, is that there are some people that love cars. They want to drive everywhere. They love their sprawl. They love not being able to walk anywhere. They love the drive-throughs. They're disgusting to me. I'm not sure if they're human beings. They might be Russian spies or like
God.
some sort of psyop operation, but they exist. And this is a freaking free country. You see that flag in Economoy's background? That's the American flag. This is a free country. This is a country where people make their own choices and they have their own preferences that we respect. Okay? And so I will not have their rights trampled on.
I
Yeah,
agree.
their right to drive on the toll roads between the cubes, right? Between Cube City A and Cube City 7.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
But I think overall that's kind of at least that's my answer overall to sum up is there's going to be types of infrastructure that are highly underinvested, and I think that one thing that we weren't able to talk about as much is that's also probably going to be greatly different if you're a developing versus more developed, sort of already wealthy nation, right? When it comes to the type of infrastructure spending that you're spending too much on, the answer is doubly so not the case that you're spending too much on it if you're a developing country. Because a lot of developing countries, there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit, right? Building a bunch of public schools and a bunch of hospitals and, a bunch of road infrastructure and, whatever it might be that you need, water infrastructure, utility infrastructure, all these kind of things that you simply just don't have because you're a developing country that is coming from a place with less sort of capital development in general. Somebody mentioned sewage infrastructure, stuff like that as well. So that when you're a developing country, your options for where to funnel money are much wider because you probably just have substantially less sort of embodied infrastructure development than we're talking about from the perspective of a wealthy nation. But from the perspective of a wealthy nation, there are probably a lot of things that you're still underinvesting in relative to what people might prefer in their infrastructure, right? So what do you guys have with regards to closing thoughts, and then we can wrap it on up?
Bring the private trains back. I want a bright line train everywhere. I want to be like Japan, okay? Competing private subway lines, because there's so many that they're just like two. Which one do I choose today, huh? Which one has the lower fares? Okay, private BRT, okay? All over the place. Public stops, private BRT. Everyone pays the price of their own transportation system. Beautiful.
Ugh.
I'm disgusted personally by that. STL, final thoughts.
I'm joining the war on cars on the side of the cube cities. It's as simple as that, okay?
Listen, we will create a platform organization to destroy car infrastructure, but then we will go our separate ways, gentlemen.